Om Jnana-timirandasya Jnananjana-shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitang Yena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Preshtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swamin Iti Namani. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarane Trinadapi Sunichena Tarad Iva Sahishnuna Amanina Manadena Kirtaniya Sadahari Hare Nama Hare Nama Hare Nama Vikevalam Kalo Nastyeva 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 Gatir Anyatha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 4, Chapter 29, Verse 32. Dukeshve katarenapi daiva bhutatma hetushu jivasya na vyavachcheda syachchet tat tat prakrit kriya. Synonyms: Dukeshu, in the matter of distress; a katarena, from one kind; api, even; daiva, providence; bhuta, other living entities; atma, the body and mind; hetushu, on account of; jivasya, of the living entity; na, never; vyavachcheda, stopping; syat, is possible; chet, although; tat tat, of those miseries; pratikriya, counteraction. Translation: the living entities are trying to counteract different miserable conditions pertaining to providence, other living entities, or the body and mind. Still, they must remain conditioned by the laws of nature, despite all attempts to counter these laws. Purport by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, founder Acharya of ISKCON. Just as a dog wanders here and there for a piece of bread or punishment, the living entity perpetually wanders about, trying to be happy and planning in so many ways to counteract material misery. This is called the struggle for existence. We can actually see in our daily lives how we are forced to make plans to drive away miserable conditions. To get rid of one miserable condition, we have to put ourselves in another kind of miserable condition. A poor man suffers for want of money, but if he wants to become rich, he has to struggle in so many ways. Actually, this is not a valid counteracting process, but a snare of the illusory energy. If one does not endeavor to counteract his situation, but is satisfied with his position, knowing that he has obtained his position through past activities, he can instead engage his energy to develop Krishna consciousness. This is recommended in all Vedic literature. Tasyaiva heto prayateta kovido lalabhyate yad brahmatam uparyadaha talabhyate dukavad anyatak sukam kalena sarvatra gabira rangasa. Persons who are actually intelligent and philosophically inclined should endeavor only for that purposeful end, which is not obtainable even by wandering from the topmost planet, Brahmaloka, down to the lowest planet, Patala. As far as happiness derived from sense enjoyment is concerned, it can be obtained automatically in course of time, just as in course of time we obtain miseries, even though we do not desire them. One should simply try to develop his Krishna consciousness and not waste his time trying to improve his material condition. Actually, the material condition cannot be improved. The process of improvement means accepting another miserable condition. However, if we endeavor to improve our Krishna consciousness, the distresses of material life will disappear without extraneous endeavor. Krishna therefore promises, Kaunteya pratijanihi na me bhakta pranasyati. O son of Kunti, declare it boldly that my devotee never perishes. One who takes to the path of devotional service will never be vanquished, despite all miseries of the body and mind, and despite all misery brought about by other living entities and providence, miseries which are beyond our control. So that ends Prabhupada's purport, and I have written out my lecture for today. So first, there's this letter to Satsvarupa Das. Prabhupada was in Los Angeles, and this was on July 1st, 1972. Quote, so far your question, yes, it is good to be prepared with a well-thought lecture in advance. However, we must be able to preach effectively at a moment's notice or under any conditions or circumstances also. As you begin to study the Sanskrit words, in each word you will find a treasure house of different understanding. So this I had read maybe about 10, 12 years ago, but I didn't remember where I read it. And so yesterday I researched it, and after about a half an hour, I finally found this quote. And this last line about this studying the Sanskrit words, I have been using that for the past 12 years or more as the basis of how I preach and give class. So let's go over some of the words that I find very instructive. So one word was the word dukeshu, in the matter of distress. And in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, we see here Lord Chaitanya instructing Sanatana Goswami. Due to his being opposed to Krishna consciousness, the conditioned soul is punished by the witch of the external energy, Maya. He is thus ready to suffer the threefold miseries. Number 1, adhyatmika, miseries brought about by the body and mind. 2, adhibautika, the inimical behavior of other living entities. And number 3, adhidaivaka, natural disturbances caused by the demigods. Lord Chaitanya continues, in this way, the conditioned soul becomes the servant of lusty desires. And when these are not fulfilled, he becomes the servant of anger and continues to be kicked by the external energy, Maya. Wandering and wandering throughout the universe, he may by chance get the association of a devotee physician whose instructions and hymns make the witch of the external energy flee. The conditioned soul thus gets in touch with devotional service to Lord Krishna, and in this way he can approach nearer and nearer to the Lord. Then Lord Chaitanya quotes a verse, O my Lord, there is no limit to the unwanted orders of lusty desires. Although I have rendered these desires so much service, they have not shown any mercy to me. I have not been ashamed to serve them, nor have I even desired to give them up. O my Lord, O head of the Yadu dynasty. Recently, however, my intelligence has been awakened, and now I am giving them up. Due to transcendental intelligence, I now refuse to obey the unwanted orders of these desires, and I now come to you to surrender myself at your fearless lotus feet. Kindly engage me in your personal service and save me. So the other nice word that gave me much inspiration in this verse is the word daiva, or providence. And I remembered this quote from the Nectar of Devotion, where Prabhupada explains this word nicely. Bhakti Ras, however, the mellow relished in the transcendental loving service of the Lord, does not finish with the end of life. It continues perpetually, and is therefore called Amrita, that which does not die, but exists eternally. This is confirmed in all Vedic literatures. Bhagavad Gita says, Nehabhikrama nashosti pratyavayo navidyate svapam apyasya dharmasya trayate mahato bhayat. That little advancement in bhakti rasa can save the devotee from the greatest danger, that of missing the opportunity for human life. The rasas derived from our feelings in social life, in family life, or in the greater family life of altruism, philanthropy, nationalism, socialism, communism, etc., do not guarantee that one's next life will be as a human being. We prepare our next life by our actual activities in the present life. A living entity is offered a particular type of body as a result of his action in the present body. These activities are taken into account by a superior authority known as Daiva, or the authority of God. This Daiva is explained in Bhagavad Gita as the prime cause of everything. Adishtanang tatak karta karnang cha pritag vidham vividhas cha pritak cheshta daivang chaivatra panchamam. Number 1, the place of action, the body. 2, the performer. 3, the various senses. 4, the many different kinds of endeavor. And ultimately, number 5, the supersoul. These are the 5 factors of action. And in Srimad Bhagavatam, it is stated that a man takes his next body by Daiva Netrena, which means by the supervision of the authority of the Supreme. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Karmana Daiva Netrena Jantur Deho Papataye Striya Pravishta Udarang Pungso Reta Kanasraya. The personality of Godhead, Kapila Dev, said, under the supervision of the Supreme Lord, and according to the result of his work, the living entity, the soul, is made to enter into the womb of a mother, a womb of a woman, through the particle of male semen, to assume a particular type of body. In an ordinary sense, Daiva is explained as destiny. Daiva supervision gives us a body selected from 8,400,000 forms. The choice does not depend on our selection, but is awarded to us according to our destiny. If our body at present is engaged in the activities of Krishna consciousness, then it is guaranteed that we will have at least a human body in our next life. A human being engaged in Krishna consciousness, even if unable to complete the course of Bhakti Yoga, takes birth in the higher divisions of human society so that he can automatically further his advancement in Krishna consciousness. Therefore, all bona fide activities in Krishna consciousness are amrita, or permanent. This is the subject matter of the nectar of devotion. Then, the last two lines of today's verse, Jivasyana vyavachcheda syachchet tat tat pratikriya. So here it says, still, the living entity must remain conditioned by the laws of nature, despite all attempts to counter these laws. So in the Bhagavad Gita, there are many verses which describe the conditioning of the material, by the material energy on the living entity. So in chapter 14, Sattvang Rajastama iti guna prakriti sambhava nibadnanti mahabaho dehe dehinam avyayam. Material nature consists of three modes: goodness, passion, and ignorance. When the eternal living entity comes in contact with nature, O mighty armed Arjuna, he becomes conditioned by these modes. Tatra sattvang nimalatvat prakashakam anamayam sukha sangena badnati jnana sangena chanaga. O sinless one, the mode of goodness, being purer than the others, is illuminating and frees one from all sinful reactions. Those situated in that mode become conditioned by a sense of happiness and knowledge. Rajo ragatmikang vidhi trishna sanga samudbhavam tad nibadnati kaunteya karma sangena dehinam. The mode of passion is born of unlimited desires and longings, O son of Kunti, and because of this, the embodied living entity is bound to material fruitive actions. Tamastvajnana jang vidhi mohanang sarvadehinam pramadalasya nidrabis tad nibadnati bharata. O son of Bharata, know that the mode of darkness born of ignorance is the delusion of all embodied living entities. The results of this mode are madness, indolence, and sleep, which bind the conditioned soul. And finishing this string of verses, Sattvang Sukhe Sanjayati Raja Karmani Bharata Jnanam Avritya Tuttama Pramade Sanjayatya Yuta. O son of Bharata, the mode of goodness conditions one to happiness. Passion conditions one to fruitive action. And ignorance, covering one's knowledge, binds one to madness. So, before I read further, here it is clear in chapter 14 that as long as one is associating or under the influence of any of these three modes of nature, then one is still conditioned. And in chapter 14, towards the end, Arjuna's final question, he asked three questions, and the third question was the one that was most significant. Arjuna said, how does one transcend the modes of nature? Because that's what it means to become unconditioned. You have to transcend the modes of nature. Even the mode of goodness is a condition. So Krishna's response to how to become unconditioned, how to transcend the modes of nature, is the famous verse, Mangchayo vyabhicharena bhakti yogena sevate sagunan samatityaitan brahma bhuyaya kalpate. That one has to engage in the one or more processes of devotional service of what you're doing right now hearing, the first process. But this kind of devotional service, either 1, 2, 3, or all 9, have to be performed 24/7, 365, continuously, just like my name that Prabhupada gave me, Nirantara, without any cessation. So that's how devotional service must be performed if one wants to become unconditioned, if one wants to be liberated. So further on this, quotes from Gita on being conditioned, the famous verse, Mamai Bangsho Jiva Loke, Jiva Bhuta Sanatana, Manakshastan Indriyani, Prakriti Stani Karshati. The living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. So this is material existence. We are simply struggling with the 6 senses. Either the 5 knowledge acquiring senses and the mind, or the 5 working senses in the mind. That's our whole material existence. We are struggling with these 6 senses, and of course, the mind. And we recall in chapter 6 of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna pointed out to Arjuna that the mind can be your best friend, and the mind can be your worst enemy. If the mind is controlled, then your mind is your best friend. But if the mind is uncontrolled, then it's your worst enemy. And Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has given us the best process to control the mind. Cheto Darpana Marjanam. We simply have to cleanse the mirror of the mind by chanting the Maha Mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. The more we can fix our minds on each of the syllables, each of the words of the Maha Mantra, then we are purifying the mirror of the mind, the heart. And finally, in Bhagavad Gita, in the 18th chapter, Machchitta Sarva Durgani, Mat Prasadat Tarishyasi, Atachetvam Ahankaran, Nashrosyasi Vanangsyasi. If you become conscious of me, you will pass over all the obstacles of conditioned life by my grace. So this is in essence what is the Krishna consciousness process. We're simply trying to be ever conscious of Krishna, and that is how we propose to cross over all the obstacles. It was also stated by Krishna similarly in chapter 7, Daivihi Esha Gunamayi, Mama Maya Duratya, Mam Evaye Prapadyante, Mayam Etang Tarantite. So that last line, Mayam Etam Tarantite, Taranti, to cross over. And into today, this Gita verse, Durgani, Durga, the fort of the material energy. It's insurmountable. Virtually no one can escape. And this 7th chapter verse, 7:14, the only way to conquer over the fortress of material existence, or sometimes it's compared to a fathomless ocean, the only way is to surrender to Krishna. And you surrender to Krishna by being ever conscious of him. That's why Lord Chaitanya says, Kirtaniya Sada Hari. Always you should be chanting my name, so that at every step you can be conquering over. This last line, Mayam Etang Tarantite, corresponds to the line in the song Bhaja Hure Mana, Srinanda Nandana, Abhaya Charanara Vindare, Durlabha Manava Janama Satsange, Taroho e bhava sindhure. So that line, taroho in Bengali, that word, is the same as the Sanskrit word taranti that was mentioned by the 7:14 verse. So taroho bhava sindhu. Bhava sindhu, the ocean of material existence. So many times in the Vedas, material existence is compared to an impassable ocean. But as Krishna says here, and as he says in that 7:14 verse, if you simply surrender, if you simply become ever conscious of Krishna, as he says here, you will pass over all the obstacles of conditioned life by my grace. In contrast, the impersonalist, he wants to cross over the ocean of material existence by his own strength. That is how the impersonalist, because the impersonalist does not believe in God, the person. So the impersonalist has to do it all on his own. But the devotee is much more intelligent. Everything is done by Krishna's grace. Simply by surrendering, simply by loving, simply by always thinking of Krishna. And we are reminded at this time of that verse in the 10th canto, where it is stated that the whole material existence, even though it's insurmountable, shrinks down to the amount of water contained in the calf's hoofprint if one simply engages in Krishna consciousness by hearing and chanting. Lord Chaitanya emphasizes that of all the 9 processes, hearing and chanting are the fundamentals. Everything is based on hearing and chanting. That's why this morning Bhagavatam class and evening Bhagavad Gita class are so important. Simply by hearing the lecture, the kirtan, then we are easily crossing over material existence. This final verse here in this 18th chapter. If, however, you do not work in such consciousness, but act through false ego, not hearing me, you will be lost. So this word false ego must mean, there's no sense in mentioning false ego unless there is a true ego. So there is ego. Ego is not denied. Ego means identification. But there's true ego and false ego. True ego is taught by Lord Chaitanya to Sanatan Goswami, Jivera Swarupahai, Krishnera Nitya Das. Lord Chaitanya pointed out that the real ego of the living entity is to be the eternal subordinate servant of Krishna, either in the spiritual world or in the material world. The living entity is ever the servant, never the master. The master, the Purusha, is God, Krishna, or one of his Svangsha expansions. The living entity, Vibhina Angsha, is the eternal servant of Purusha, God, the enjoyer. So false ego means to think myself something other than the eternal servant of God. That's false ego. Doesn't matter what it is. If I think of myself something other than the eternal servant of Krishna, then I am experiencing false ego. But when I'm in Krishna consciousness, then I am in true ego. Not hearing me, you will be lost. Because yes, the material world is like a prison. Durga, it's like a prison. From the topmost planet down to the lowest planet, all are places of misery where repeated birth and death take place. That was mentioned by Krishna in chapter 8, from the top to the bottom. All are places of misery where repeated birth and death take place. So to remain in material existence, in the prison, in the fortress, That is what is meant by being lost. Because the real goal of life is to become free, to become liberated, to go back home, back to Godhead. So now, to end out my lecture, there were some lines in the purport that I wanted to explain. So here's one sentence from the purport. Just as a dog wanders here and there for a piece of bread or punishment, the living entity perpetually wanders about, trying to be happy and planning in so many ways to counteract material misery. This is called the struggle for existence. So, reading this sentence reminded me of this famous verse from the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Brahmanda Brahmate Kon Bhagyavan Jeev Guru Krishna Prasade Pai Bhakti Lata Bij. According to their karma, all living entities are wandering throughout the universe. Some of them are being elevated to the upper planetary systems, and some are going down into the lower planetary systems. Out of many millions of wandering living entities, one who is very fortunate gets an opportunity to associate with a bona fide spiritual master by the grace of Krishna. By the mercy of both Krishna and the spiritual master, such a person receives the seed of the creeper of devotional service. Another sentence in the purport that I found inspiring: to get rid of one miserable condition, we have to put ourselves into another kind of miserable condition. So that reminded me of this purport section from the Nectar of Instruction. I remembered this. When a man in the material world takes more interest in the materialistic way of life than in Krishna consciousness, he is considered to be in a diseased condition. The normal condition is to remain an eternal servant of the Lord. Here it is. We just mentioned this. Jivera Swarupahai Krishnara Nitya Das. This healthy condition is lost when the living entity forgets Krishna due to being attracted by the external features of Krishna's Maya energy. This world of Maya is called Durashraya, which means false or bad shelter. One who puts his faith in Durashraya becomes a candidate for hoping against hope. In the material world, everyone is trying to become happy, and although their material attempts are baffled in every way, due to their nescience means ignorance, they cannot understand their mistakes. And here is the line that I remembered. People try to rectify one mistake by making another mistake. This is the way of the struggle for existence in the material world. If one in this condition is advised to take to Krishna consciousness and be happy, he does not accept such instructions. Then, there was another line in the purport that gave me inspiration. To get rid of one miserable condition, we have to put ourselves in another kind of miserable condition. And of course, that reminded me of the prayers of Prahlad Maharaj. Yasmat priya priya viyoga sanyoga janma shokagnina sakala yonishu dayamana dukau sadang tat api dukam atadhiyaham bhuman brahmami vadameta vadasya yogam. Prahlad Maharaj prayed to Lord Nisringa, O Great One, O Supreme Lord, because of combination with pleasing and displeasing circumstances, and because of separation from them, one is placed in a most regrettable position within heavenly or hellish planets, as if burning in a fire of lamentation. Although there are many remedies by which to get out of miserable life, any such remedies in the material world are more miserable than the miseries themselves. Therefore, I think that the only remedy is to engage in your service. Kindly instruct me in such service. And finally, the last part of the purport that inspired me was this quote Prabhupada gave from the first canto, chapter 5, where Narada is instructing Vyasadeva that he should compile Srimad Bhagavatam. Here, Narada says, as far as happiness derived from sense enjoyment is concerned, it can be obtained automatically in course of time, just as in course of time we obtain miseries, even though we do not desire them. And I remembered a corresponding verse again, Prahlad teaching his classmates, Sukam Aindriyakam Daitya Deha Yogena Dehinam Sarvatra Labhyate Daivad Yata Dukam Ayatnata. Prahlad Maharaj continued, my dear friends, born of demoniac families, the happiness perceived with reference to the sense objects by contact with the body can be obtained in any form of life according to one's past fruitive activities. Such happiness is automatically obtained without endeavor, just as we obtain distress. So I'll read the verse and purport one more time, and then we'll have Ishtagoshti. Dukeshva ketarenapi daiva bhutatma hetushu jivasya na vyavachcheda syachchet tat pratikriya. The living entities are trying to counteract different miserable conditions pertaining to providence, other living entities, or the body and mind. Still, they must remain conditioned by the laws of nature, despite all attempts to counter these laws. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So now we can questions and answers.
Hare Krishna, Nirantara Prabhu. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Who is speaking?
Balaram Das.
Oh, may Krishna bless you, my best friend.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your, we asked you kind of last minute, so happy you were able to do that.
I took it as a sign from Krishna.
Yeah, in relation to, in relation to determination, it's, maybe you could just comment on that, like becoming determined, because, even though like this purport is talking about material existence and there's so much suffering and we're wandering like a dog and this and that, but still it's, we see that even though there's so much suffering and there's so much misery, people, they just can't get it together enough to get the determination to engage, in long-time spiritual life. So maybe you could just comment on, ways of getting that determination, or maybe some things that have worked for you over the years, or.
Okay. So, determination, either in the material world, but especially in spiritual life, is all dependent on association. That is why having an international society for Krishna consciousness was very vital for Prabhupada. He knew we cannot execute spiritual life on our own. As I mentioned, the impersonalist tries to do everything on his own. But the devotee needs to get inspiration by association. So, in order to become determined, you need to become inspired. Like we say in ISKCON, fired up. But how do you get fired up? It's by association. So, here are the things we associate. Spiritual master. Why do you think Prabhupada instituted Guru Puja? Not so that people will worship him. No. Prabhupada knew we needed to get inspiration. So by worshiping the spiritual master, you get enthusiasm and inspiration, and that gives you the determination. Another way we get determination through association is with other devotees. When we see other devotees who are advancing, that inspires you yourself. That's why it's so important to associate with each other. And we look at this other devotee. We look at, say, Vijay. We look at Dravida. And we say, my God, they have stayed so staunchly in this movement for so many years. Look what they have achieved. That should give me inspiration. That should give me enthusiasm. And of course, the way I get inspired is by hearing Prabhupada's sound vibration. I listen to Prabhupada chanting, singing every day for at least an hour every day. While I was composing the lecture last night, I was simply listening to Prabhupada chant japa. I had that playing in the background, and for several hours, as I did all my homework and research, I was hearing Prabhupada, the slow japa tape, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, the slow one. And every day, for at least an hour, I'm listening to Prabhupada bhajans. And of course, reading Prabhupada's books should also help you to become determined. In the material world, they have so many self-help books. So many books are being written day after day after day to give people certain kinds of material enthusiasm and knowledge and encouragement. But our goal is Krishna consciousness. So associating with Guru, with the Shastras, and with other devotees, by staying in good association, that will give you the enthusiasm to become determined. Association. What say you, Balaram Dasa?
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Was that satisfactory?
Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, well, it looks like there's no other comments or questions at the moment. So, but thank you very much.
No, I thank you, because by doing all this preparation, I became enlivened, enthused, and more determined.
Nice. Well, we hope we could see you soon, sometime in person.
Anytime. I am available anytime unless I have a previous engagement. But my policy is, as soon as there is an opportunity, I must take it.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
just let me
Maybe
know.
maybe a last thing, because I never really heard you give that. I never really heard you personally give your account of that time you were in Atlanta and you asked that question to Prabhupada, what pleases you the most.
Yes,
Maybe you could give that if you don't
yes.
mind.
I guess over the years that has become a famous thing. So it was 1975. I was a brahmachari traveling. I was on traveling Sankirtan with another devotee. We were from the Brooklyn temple, and we worked our way down to Atlanta, and we arrived there when the entire Radha Damodar brahmachari buses arrived also. So there were several dozen of young brahmacharis who were traveling with the Radha Damodar party, and they also converged on the scene there in Atlanta. Prabhupada had been traveling, and so he arrived in Atlanta, and the very first meeting was also significant. When Prabhupada arrived in the temple, the Vyasasana is at the other end of the temple, facing the large Gaur Nitai deities. And I was at this time sitting right up front as possible to Prabhupada's Vyasasana. And Prabhupada started to speak on the phrase Parama Karuna. And he was looking at the temple room full of these nice, pure, young brahmacharis, book distributors, and looking at Gaur Nitai, and he became overwhelmed, and he started to cry. He couldn't speak. He wanted to speak about how merciful is Nitai Gaura Chandra, but after a few seconds he started to cry, and the whole temple room became silent. Nobody knew what to do. So after a few moments, Prabhupada excused himself, and he said that we would meet in the evening, and we would have a nice program in the evening. So I got to see Prabhupada shed ecstatic tears. So the Sunday feast is when that event occurred. Prabhupada gave a lecture, and this time I was at the other end of the temple by the deities. And so I was thinking, this may be my only chance to ask Prabhupada a question. So when Prabhupada finished his lecture and he was asking questions, at some point I raised my hand and I said, Prabhupada, what pleases you the most? Because at that time in ISKCON, the general preaching that you heard everywhere you went, got to go out and distribute books. That's the only way, just distribute books. That was like the fever in ISKCON. Must go out doing books, otherwise you're in Maya. That was how things were being presented. So I guess I wanted to hear it directly from Prabhupada so that I would get determined and fired up. I wanted to hear it. So I asked Prabhupada, what pleases you the most? And Prabhupada's servant at that time was Tamal Krishna Goswami, and Prabhupada went, And so it seemed as though Prabhupada wanted to hear the question again. So Tamal Krishna said, Prabhupada, what pleases you the most? So Prabhupada closed his eyes, tilted his head, and said, when you love Krishna. And everybody was shocked because everyone was expecting, what pleases him the most is book distribution, but that's not what he said. He said, when you love Krishna. So I take that as personal instruction from Srila Prabhupada, that in this lifetime, I must learn how to love Krishna. Okay?
Thank you.
That's the way I remember it.
All right, appreciate it. Okay, so yeah, it looks like there's no other questions or comments. So yeah, thank you once again, and we hope to see you soon.
Hare Krishna, Hare
Hare
Krishna,
Krishna,
Krishna
Krishna
Krishna,
Krishna,
Hare Hare,
Hare Hare,
Hare
Hare
Rama,
Rama,
Hare
Hare
Rama,
Rama, Rama
Rama Rama,
Rama,
Hare
Hare Hare.
Hare.
Chat.